Greetings, my name is Raphael, and welcome to Where the Flowers Refuse to Grow.
These are all drums. Drums. These are all.
It has been a very long while since I can completely say that my small brain finally completed something cool, and that cool thing is finishing William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. How a troglodyte like myself was able to finish such a modernist text, I don't know, but it was easier to get through or to even attempt than Joyce's Ulysses. Tangent aside, let's get into it. So what is The Sound and the Fury and why you should be afraid of it?
What do you think we don't read?
What are you reading?
The Sound and the Fury.
Faulkner.
You two are reading Faulkner?
Yes, we are. What?
Is that-
Oh,
what
you're
do
the
you got?
only intellectual
What
in
do
the
you got,
bunch?
the Cliff Notes, huh?
What are you doing?
Yes, ladies and ghouls, this text follows the Compson family at the turn of the century in Mississippi. Taking place between 1910 and 1928, the time and scenes fluctuate between those, especially between the first chapter, as I'll kind of dig into later. But before we go any further, all one of you might be asking me, what the hell is modernism? Well, as far as I can recall from the literature classes I did not attend in college, modernism was kind of a rebirth, not like the Renaissance, but a rebirth of what is literature. Modernism essentially turned away from whatever the style was at the time and tried to reinvent itself. And of course, we're referring to literature pre, during, and post World War I. That easily sums up what I can recall, but let's look at textbook definition of modernism because again, I have a small brain here, folks. Please forgive me. According to Britannica.com, the modernist impulse is fueled in various literatures by industrialization and urbanization and by the search for an authentic response to a much changed world. All right, so a point for me for hitting it close to the mark, kind of. But that idea of change, industrialization, and kind of checking where we are at the moment. And one can definitely see that with Virginia Woolf, James Joyce in Ireland, and our Americana writer that we're talking about right now, William Faulkner. As an immortal person who's been around in the early 20th century and was able to see this change, you can you can absolutely tell that modernist text is totally breaking literary styles. I mean, with contemporary literature now and postmodernism, you can give us anything and we'll read it, we'll digest it, we'll take it as whatever the hell it is. However, back then, I'm sure the case was so different to think that you can put down paragraphs upon paragraphs without punctuation, without quotation marks. You don't know who's talking. You don't know where one sentence ends and one sentence begins. That essentially is, I think, like one of the craziest takeaways from modernist literature, and you can definitely tell in The Sound and the Fury. In Chapter 1, Dr. Manhattan and Benjamin. So basically, before we get into it, think weird textual style in early Americana, like To Kill a Mockingbird, but much more difficult to digest because it's really crazy and all over the place. All right, let's go. Watchmen fans rejoice and recoil at the same time, for the first chapter in this book, The Sound and the Fury, is absolutely the most difficult. Taken from the perspective of Maury Compson, also known as Benji, also known as Benjamin Compson, because they changed his name as they did not like the association with the first name. The first chapter is absolutely the most difficult. I do declare, like Dr. Manhattan in Alan Moore's Watchmen, this chapter is everything and nothing at the same time. Very much like Senor Manhattan, Faulkner writes Benjamin's perspective in these little moments. Because the character is mentally disabled, he doesn't perceive time like we do. It's such an arduous puzzle piece to put together this first chapter because in some instances you'll find Benjamin hanging out with his siblings as a child, and then all of a sudden it'll flash forward without any notice, without any style change. It's like in the same paragraph, sometimes in the next paragraph, that we flash forward to different characters at a different time in a different space.
A clock without a craftsman. It's too late. Always has been. Always will be. Too late.
It's so interesting how this chapter unfolds because as Faulkner tells the story through Benjamin's perspective, these moments are only tethered through like these several connections. Those connections being his sister Caddy, the fireplace, and a few smells here and there. Another interesting point is how it's understood because everything is written really well. However, it's just disjointed. For example, her hair was like fire, and little points of fire were in her eyes. And I went, and father lifted me into the chair too, and Caddy held me. She smelled like trees. She smelled like trees. In the corner it was dark, but I could see the window. I squatted there, holding the slipper. I couldn't see it, but my hand saw it, and I could hear it getting night. And my hand saw the slipper, but I couldn't see myself. But my hands could see the slipper, and I squatted there, hearing it getting dark. Yeah, man, I know. You're like, what, bro? What? So in that little excerpt I just read, it jumps from one paragraph to another, but that second paragraph is all in italics. Now, I haven't looked at the Spark Notes for what that means, but I noticed that there are some moments in Benji's chapter where an italic paragraph is repeated later on, not in italics. So it's definitely discussing some other different point in time. Oh, and the version I'm reading is a 1957 version of the modern library tale of The Sound and the Fury, just in case if you're wondering. Digression aside, and to my first point, you're instantly thrown into this modernist misjuncture of a text. Look, it ain't easy going through Benjamin's thoughts. Honestly, I wish I could pretend I understood what the hell was going on, but it took me a long time just to get through that first chapter. But in this chapter, we learn so many things. As I mentioned, the tethers, especially to Caddy, who's one of the more important characters. She doesn't have her own chapter, but she is definitely one of the like solid background characters who kind of like make the story unfold as it does. Yeah, Caddy is the crutch of everything in this story, I'd say. And it's because of her you have these chapters of her siblings. Once again, Benjamin, the one who's mentally disabled, Quentin, who we'll get to in a second, Jason, the very stern and very old school style brother, and then it mentions Caddy's daughter, also named Quentin, and then we have a last chapter kind of summing everything up. But to continue on with Benjamin's chapter and this first part, it's difficult. However, I think it's so important in showcasing what modernism is about. Listing authors being pretentious like me, Faulkner, Woolf, and Joyce give the reader a difficult task. As difficult as this chapter was, Faulkner absolutely demonstrates modernism at its height. You know, it was a reassessing of what literature could be and what was printed. Because imagine, just think about all those high school and college papers you wrote where you forgot a punctuation. Now, imagine the turn of the century Mississippi where some guy or some group of folks are putting out texts without punctuation. Of course, academia and printed books are two totally different things, especially today, but it's so interesting to think of this as canon in the literature world. I mean, yeah, sure, one could call it lazy, but it's definitely lazy with a purpose. I mean, others could say it's avant-garde, and yeah, I mean, just like to use, pretentious points, I would say that too, because goddamn, I'm not going to refrain from saying this text is easy, because this first part especially is, again, the hardest chapter in the entire book. Just regarding the flow of difficulty, it definitely starts off so hard, but it becomes easier as it goes down. So it's kind of bringing the new into the colloquial. But that transition will only be seen for those folks who stick with the book. I mean, I try to read Ulysses every single goddamn year, and I fail every single year. The most I've gotten to was like 100 pages. I tried it again a few months ago. I mean, even in like the first 20, 30 pages, Joyce writes something like, Malachi Mulligan. Can you imagine 2 dactyls? And then you have to stop and look up what dactyls are. And in difficulty sense, I would say that this is the same. However, because I'm an American or raised in America, it's definitely easier to picture this Americana Mississippi, thank you movies. So I do declare thank you movies for making it easier to picture stuff like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Sound and the Fury. Otherwise, it'd be very, very difficult to ascertain how Ireland would look or wherever the Ulysses took place. And this chapter is essentially the definition of modernism. It was the reanalysis of what literature could be. Chapter 2. Pure Love and Quentin Compson. Taken from the perspective of the golden child Quentin Compson, this chapter is about his obsession with his sister, his sibling, Caddy. Now, Quentin Compson was the golden child of the Compson household. He was the prince that was promised, and they sold off their lands just so they could pay for his tuition at Harvard. Now, the Compson name was powerful pre-Civil War, as they held plantations, lands, and slaves. So Quentin Compson seems like the acquiescence of the family name trying to turn around in a new America. And crazy enough, for like a first generation to accomplish something in a foreign country, and we see with Quentin, it inevitably fails. He inevitably fails. This second chapter is essentially Quentin attempting to prevent Caddy from ruining her life by stopping a marriage. Now, there is a character intro that says that he does not physically lust for his sister, and that his love may be more akin to, say, Dante loving Beatrice and that kind of divine love. However, in this chapter, this saucy chapter, there are definitely moments of that physical lust that manifest, especially, I don't know if you'd call it a dream sequence or a memory, but there is definitely some physical form there. In vying to protect Caddy from her fiance at the time, he literally threatens the fiance, and in doing so, he gets beat up. And simply enough, like, the chapter just ends shortly after that. He has a few appointments. He walks around an immigrant child who does not know the language. She's lost in a bakery, helps get her bread, and then she finds her father. And soon the chapter ends. Now, this chapter definitely flows a lot easier than Benjamin's chapter. And you can definitely tell. And I want to say it was absolutely intentional, as, you know, he's a Harvard student, a contemporary American student, one of the finest colleges at the time, if not the best. And so Quentin's stream of consciousness, like the modernism that comes out, is definitely structured. But there is a point when it collapses. The infrastructure of thought is destroyed as he's having an argument with Caddy's fiance. He essentially tells the fiance, you know, to get out, to don't bother her, leave her alone, because he knows he's not good enough. And in the paragraph before, you see it end in quotations, but the following argument is done in a big block text. I don't believe there's punctuation, there's no periods, there's no quotation marks. It's absolutely line after line of just Quentin Compson's it going straight forward. It's essentially Quentin Compson steamrolling as much as he can. It still includes the fiance in the conversation, but infrastructure is completely destroyed. Excuse me, there's a phone call. Hello? Moments like this in a modernist text would usually go over my small brain, but I think it was so beautifully implemented and intended that it was really easy to catch. It's definitely a moment that escalates the Sound and the Fury into essential modernist readings.
What's
Thank
wrong
you.
with Faulkner?
Oh, yeah. You have a great interest in turn-of-the-century Mississippi.
I do.
Yeah.
Well, you enjoy your book. I don't need a club to read a book, but...
Chapter 3, The Old Mississippi South, and Jason Compson. Jason Compson is essentially the old guard of the South. He believes people have their place, and that means whether you're a man, woman, black, white, a Jew, a foreigner, you have your place and everyone should abide by their place. I never promise woman anything. No let her know what I'm going to give her. That's the only way to manage them. Always keep them guessing. If you can't think of any other way to surprise them, give them a bust in the jaw. Yeah, so essentially, his character is very surface level. Everything is laid out flat, just like the women that he uppercuts. And to tie this idea back to modernism, his chapter is very straightforward. It's like a high schooler's journal. There's nothing deep about it. It's essentially how their day went and what's going on. Person A has a dialogue, they says. Jason has a dialogue, I says. Person C has a dialogue, they says. It's essentially such a different way to tell a story compared to Benjamin and Quentin. I mean, just to go back to the last chapter and Quentin's obsession with Caddy, there you see his stream of consciousness falling onto the page. And here, any turmoil or any like inner thoughts are kept away from the people he's talking to and the audience. It's so interesting to see how different characters are written by William Faulkner. It's insane to think about. and to have such complex literary styles juxtaposed to this simple chapter, I truly think that embodies modernism. Not only are you having like this dichotomy between the new and the old, you're also having a dichotomy of styles as well. Now, this chapter essentially follows Jason and his attempt to curb Quentin, his niece. Yes, in this chapter, we discover that Caddy actually has a child and names her Quentin. However, Caddy is now, I believe, living somewhere in California or somewhere far away. She had like multiple failed marriages. She's living far away, but she's always sending money to Jason just for her daughter. But as I mentioned earlier, Jason being of the old ways, he's very adamant of keeping things his way. For Caddy's promiscuity, she's essentially banned from the Compson household. Her name is basically never spoken. And as a man of the household, everything essentially falls to him. With his father dead, Quentin, his brother, drowning himself, the golden boy of the household is gone. He essentially has to man up, as I bet he would put it that way, and take over and make sure everything goes right. A man is supposed to do what a man is supposed to do. And in Jason's case, that basically means everything is patriarchal. He essentially attempts to control everything. He feels it is his responsibility to make sure all things are running smoothly and everyone follows the plan that society has for them. In Chapter 4, Dilsey, the Servant of God. So this chapter follows Dilsey, the old black servant of the Compson family. And it's kind of interesting because you see here Dilsey sort of apologizing and protecting the Compson's way of life. Dilsey's chapter is interesting as some parts in there kind of reverberate what Jason mentions and what Quentin mentions in his chapter as well. Quentin early on mentions how folks are essentially all the same, whether you're black or you're white. But as I brought up earlier with Jason, he thinks everyone has their place. And interestingly enough, Dilsey says something like, white folk have their business and we have ours. So even though Dilsey has been a part of the Compsons for the longest time, you can still see that there is some echo, some remnant of like the old Mississippi South that still lingers with even Dilsey, who's seeing this new era of America. This chapter is essentially Dilsey and her son Lester heading out to church for Sunday service. So this chapter is the shortest of them all, running in around like 35 pages compared to the previous chapters were about 100. So in this chapter, we're basically just given another perspective. Now, rounding up these perspectives, we're going to go to my favorite part. Part 5, Themes and the Degradation of a New Society. So I recently started this booktuber, a Natty Nook. Check the description and be sure to subscribe for her. Very smart, very well read, unlike me. So Nat mentioned she tries to read 1 hour a day, which is 59 more minutes than I read. There was a tip she mentioned: instead of scrolling through social media, try to fill that time with reading. And so sitting up at 3 a.m. in my existential purgatory, as I usually do, I thought to do the same thing. And I found this New Yorker article discussing William Faulkner as a racist and apologist for like the Old South. And it's crazy because I read this after Quentin's chapter, and I thought Quentin's character was absolutely very progressive. I said it before, and Quentin essentially says all folks are the same, whether you're black or you're white. And even by helping that Italian lost girl, he's kind of equating everyone to the same playing field. However, looking at this article, it got me thinking back to my comparative literature days, where you separate the text from the author. And with The Sound and the Fury, it's so text-breaking to think that he wrote these progressive themes, or maybe I'm reading it as like a progressive theme. But there is definitely that idea of a changing America. Education was definitely the way, and you see this attempt to change with Quentin Compson. However, from an old family, remember, the Compsons held slaves, they held plantations. From an old family like that to try to pave a new way, a new Compson name with Quentin, and it ends up in absolute failure. He kills himself. His ties to Caddy, this idea of Southern incest, was the downfall of modernization for the Compsons. And if you look at it, Jason is the last competent Compson alive. I mean, he's the head of the household. He's not exiled as Caddy was. He's not promiscuous like Quentin, his niece. He didn't kill himself. He took the time to become the patriarch of the family. But in a sense, he is not ready to transition into this new America. He still believes that black folk are different from white folk, that immigrants are different from white folk. He still has his old ways set about him. Though everything around Jason changes or is changing, he seems to refuse it. But he is still the last one left standing, essentially. But then again, The Sound and the Fury still paints a dramatic shift of cultures. The new Compson generation has already failed. The old Compsons failed when the South lost, and these new Compsons failed as they cannot abide by new society. You know, kind of like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and 100 Years of Solitude, there's like no more room for this family. It seems that no matter what they tried, they were doomed to fail. Just their existence was meant to be wiped out. Maybe Faulkner was saying something like, there's no room for change. You either are or you are not. And if you are not, then you do not belong. And that sentiment is definitely reverberated with Jason's chapter. You know, here's another passage. I've done what I could. A man that can live as long as I have and not know when to quit is a fool, especially as it's no business of mine. So it seems like even Jason, the man of old Mississippi, is saying there's no room for Compsons here no more. There's no room for change because you have to be of the present. If you're of the past, then you're a relic. You don't belong here. And to go back to like the whole pretentious like modernist literary style, it seems like that's exactly the modernist sentiment in regards to how to write. There's no room here for change. It's either you wrote like they did in the classics, you know, give me a classic Dostoevsky, or you don't give me anything at all. But somehow, you know, these texts, they still make it, even though they're so difficult to read, even though they're not of the times during the turn of the century, people still read them and people still gave them their applause. And I can absolutely see why. I thought the novel was brilliant. Very difficult to read. Again, this is my small brain talking. So if you guys have any questions, comments, or insults, or you want to make a correction, I pointed out something incorrectly, or you want to give your thought on it, hey, leave it in the comments below, because again, my small brain can't comprehend everything in this book. I did just one reading of it, and it was a hard reading, I do declare, my folks, ladies, and ghouls. Thanks for tuning in. Happy holidays. And welcome to Where the Flowers Refuse to Grow. And because, you know, for extra pretentious points, here's one of my favorite quotes from the chapter. And he, every man, is the arbiter of his own virtues, but let no man prescribe for another man's well-being. And I temporary, and he was the saddest word of all. There is nothing else in the world. It was not despair until time. It's not even the time until it was. The last note sounded.
Thank you very much for your time. Come along. We have to go. We've a lot to do.
What are you doing?
Your local politics.
What the fuck is going on with you?
Goodbye.
Oh, get the fuck out of here.